I'm doing a review for this book, Caesar and Christ by Will Durant. Firstly, I want to apologise for the incorrect pronunciation throughout this review. I couldn't be bothered to look up all the correct pronunciations, so I'm apologising for all my mistakes now. This is a big review for a very big book, so let's get straight to the point. Was it worth reading this giant book? Yes, this book was fucking awesome. If you want to learn history, do it in these big fuck off volumes. It's the only way to get context of the events and the changes in society. And Durant is a wonderful writer to take you on this journey through time. There was a lot of information, much more information than I'm going to remember, but it was all comprehensible and interesting to read. Because of the sheer volume of time being written about, this is a bit of a whistle stop tour through history, but I thoroughly enjoyed it and I learned a ton. Durant tells the story of the Roman Empire from the roots of the Republic to its blossoming and then to its collapse into the Roman Catholic Church. It's about 800 years, and the most amazing thing is that it's all a gripping story. This is the third volume of Durant's history books. It reads perfectly well on its own, although I would now love to read the others as well. And I also want to praise the map of the empire in the book, which was really helpful to keep track of the Roman movements being described in the book. Durant gives a brief and flattering history of the Italian region before the Roman Empire, with most detail given to the Etruscans, who were the main group of people in Italy around 800 to 500 BC. I was surprised by how well developed these people were. They had a legal system, irrigation and drainage. They were also experienced in mining, smelting, and issuing coins. It was a feudal system with a powerful monarch and an aristocracy. You're comforted to know that throughout the Roman period, the aristocracy went to whatever lengths necessary, including corruption and murder, to hold on to their vast power and to disrupt any attempts to give power, land, or money to the lower classes. Literally nothing has changed. There are class wars between the aristocracy, the business classes, the working classes, the plebs as they're known at this time, and the underclass, the slaves. Most of the legal system only pays lip service to notions of fairness. Occasionally, there are supremely impressive individuals with a strong belief in fairness who strive to establish a better system and who will use violence to achieve it if necessary. Durant describes the establishing of the Republic and how Rome moved from being ruled by a monarchy to being ruled by an assembly with two equal consuls who ruled for 1 year. In this system, the people are sovereign, free people that is. The king is the high priest rather than all powerful monarch, and the decisions are made by the aristocracy, who are the governing body and are drawn from the founding families of Rome. The plebs are not drawn from the aristocracy, but are citizens of Rome nonetheless, and below them are the slaves. This revolution replaced the monarchy with an aristocracy that ruled Rome until Caesar. The political position of the poorer citizens was not improved. They lost the modest measure of protection with which the monarchy had shielded them from aristocratic domination. The victors called the revolution a triumph of liberty, but now and then liberty in the slogans of the strong means freedom from restraint in the exploitation of the weak. The ruling classes maintained their position and used force against any rebel who attempted to balance the social scales by giving away land or distributing food during a famine or paying off insolvent debtors. In all these examples, the individuals were slain on the charge that they were currying popular favour in an attempt to become a king. They were also not opposed to using war to distract attention away from policies that they were not enacting when they were supposed to be, or for invoking emergency powers, which meant citizens' rights could be ignored. Where have I seen emergencies used like that before? As Roman law is established, there is a very complex governing system, with the Senate, magistrates, and a class biased voting system. There are the 12 tablets of the decemvirs, which represented a change from uncertain, unwritten custom to definite written law. And there was a lot of involvement of religion in law, with many legal questions of morality being decided by priests. The book got to Hannibal, and I found these stories amazing. His ability to train and lead armies in situations of extreme adversity was breathtaking, and the lengths that Hannibal went to defend his nation and to directly threaten Rome were truly impressive. Hannibal was from the also very advanced civilization at Carthage in northern Africa. It was an empire that spread out along the North African coast as well as into Spain, the Balearic Islands, Malta, Sardinia, Corsica, and part of Sicily. It was no wonder that the Romans wanted a piece of their action. The eventual destruction of the Carthaginian Empire was hugely beneficial to Rome, but it came at a price. The Second Punic War changed the face of the Western Mediterranean. It gave Spain and all of its wealth to Rome, providing the funds for the Roman conquest of Greece. But it was the most costly of all ancient wars. It ravaged or injured half the farms of Italy, destroyed 400 towns, killed 300,000 men. It weakened democracy by showing that a popular assembly cannot wisely choose generals or direct a war. There was a big change in Roman culture after they conquered Greece. Rome absorbed aspects from many of the cultures that were brought under their control, but Greece, with its extraordinary heritage, contributed more than most and continued to be respected as an admirable influence for centuries after its conquest. The Greek conquest of Rome took the form of sending Greek religion and comedy to the Roman plebs, Greek morals, philosophy, and art to the upper classes. These Greek gifts conspired with wealth and empire in the sapping of Roman faith and character, which is one part of Hella's long revenge upon her conquerors. The Greek philosophical themes of Stoicism and Epicureanism are often referred to in this book as they play out in the Roman culture. As time went on, the general public believed less in gods and often became absorbed in philosophy and even became fully atheist. This left a spiritual vacuum that played out a moral vacuum, disintegrating the family bonds and personal responsibilities to each other. Throughout the book, there were charming descriptions of the everyday life of Romans at different stages of the empire, how they were influenced by their gods or outside influences, and how things changed, such as industry, diet, land use, and of course, the development of the road system. Of the early Roman, Durant says, the typical educated Roman of this age was orderly, conservative, loyal, sober, reverent, tenacious, severe, practical. He enjoyed discipline and would have no nonsense about liberty. He lacked imagination, even to make a mythology of his own. He could with some effort love beauty, but he could seldom create it. He could not for the life of him understand Plato or Archimedes or Christ. He could only rule the world. The first century BC was a rocky period for Rome when it almost tumbled. The Senate system was rotten to the core with corruption and was failing to create the strong leadership needed for a growing empire. The aristocracy and the rich desperately clung onto their wealth and power but failed to govern well. There were uprisings from within, from the poor and enslaved who had had enough of their bad treatment by the powerful. There were incoming attacks from all sides of the empire as outsiders sensed the weakened Roman state, and the Roman army itself was disorganized and with low morale after not being suitably rewarded for past successes. The situation looked desperate, yet when efforts were made to reform and reorganize the state, there was strong resistance from the powerful, which often ended in reformers being murdered. The lower classes were often happier to live on the state dole of grains than to work for their living. And when Marius freed the slaves, they took savage and chaotic revenge on society until they were violently stopped. Then, as now, people are idiots. As Roman democracy breaks down, the people become desperate for a strong leader to come in and sweep away the broken system. The Romans couldn't have got luckier than getting Caesar. If you're going to have an emperor, make sure they're the best person possible. And with Caesar, they came pretty close. I have been pleasantly surprised by Caesar, and I have to confess how very little I knew about him. I thought he was tyrannical and opulent, and he may well have been, but he saved the Roman Empire from its implosion, and he had a vision of Rome which in many ways was greater than the sum of its parts. This story about Caesar illustrates his character. Whilst travelling at sea, pirates captured him on the way, took him to one of their Philician lairs, and offered to free him for 20 talents. That's getting on for £1 million today. He reproached them for underestimating his value and volunteered to give them 50. Having sent his servants to raise the money, he amused himself by writing poems and reading them to his captors. They did not like them. He called them dull barbarians and promised to hang them at the earliest opportunity. When the ransom came, he hurried to Miletus, engaged vessels and crews, chased and caught the pirates, recovered the ransom, and crucified them. But being a man of great clemency, he had their throats cut first. Then he went to Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. I think this must be the perfect combination of characteristics in a man. Caesar was a great statesman. He scaled down debts, enacted severe laws against excessive interest rates, and relieved extreme cases of insolvency by establishing the law of bankruptcy essentially as it stands today. He restored the stability of the currency by basing it upon gold. He also laid the basis for the calendar that we use today. He attempted to strengthen the family and encourage childbearing, and he was instrumental in land management, including rivers and roads. There were many more things that Caesar planned to do, but which he could not get further with due to being assassinated. Later emperors recognized the benefits of his plans and brought many of them to completion. And the events that unfolded involving Caesar, Cleopatra, Antony, Octavian were better material than any great film or cheesy sitcom. The Roman Senate had become so corrupt that it took an emperor to come in and sweep away the rot. Of course, this had the drawback of greatly weakening the power of the Senate and creating a dictatorship. The new Senate gratefully yielded its major powers to one who would plan, take responsibility, and lead. They were again lucky to get a statesman as capable as Augustus. Augustus stabilized and grew the empire further and was emulated by many of his successors. The Emperor Tiberius was an interesting character, reserved and conservative. Claudius was also interesting. He amiably put freed men in high positions of power because he thought they were the best people for the job. Unfortunately, they were as corrupt or worse than the aristocracy they replaced. The opposite characters were to be found in the emperors Caligula and Nero. I felt sorry for Nero in some ways because he seems to have started off with quite enviable aims, but he just went completely mad on the fact that he was the most powerful person in the world. practically a living god. And I can totally see how that can make someone go mad. It makes me admire even more the emperors who did manage to keep their feet on the ground. Reflecting on this age of despots, Durant says the emperors themselves were the chief victims of their power. 7 of these 10 men met a violent end. Nearly all of them were unhappy, surrounded by conspiracy, dishonesty, and intrigue, trying to govern a world from the anarchy of a home. They indulged their appetites because they knew how brief was their omnipotence. They lived in the daily horror of men condemned to an early and sudden death. They went under because they were above the law. They became less than men because power had made them gods. In regard to the growing interest in philosophy, Durant says, in this loose and complex age, when freedom was so limited and life was so free, philosophy flourished alongside of sensuality, and the two were not above joining hands. The decay of the native religion had left a moral vacuum which philosophy sought to fill. Augustus and his successors had done everything they could to revitalize the old faith, except to live moral lives. Even the declared atheists among them, like Caligula and Nero, had carried out all the ritual traditionally due to the official gods. Despite these appearances, the ancient faith was diseased at the bottom and at the top. The deification of the emperors revealed not how much the upper classes thought of their rulers, but how little they thought of their gods. Among educated men, philosophy was whittling away belief, even while patronizing it. Religion would get its revenge on philosophy later. An ongoing problem for the ruling classes of Rome was that many of them were not having children. Contraception was practiced in both its mechanical and chemical forms. If these methods failed, there were many ways of procuring abortion. The decay of the ancient faith among the upper classes had washed away the supernatural support of marriage, fidelity, and parentage. The passage from farm to city had made children less of an asset, more of a liability and a toy. Women wished to be sexually rather than maternally beautiful. In general, the desire for individual freedom seemed to be running counter to the needs of the race. To accentuate the evil, legacy hunting had become the most profitable occupation in Italy. The infertility of the moneyed classes was so offset by immigration and the fecundity of the poor that the population of Rome and the empire continued to grow. The aristocracy was as numerous as before, but it was almost wholly altered in origin. There was a lot of entertainment for the masses, such as athletic contests comprising racing, discus, wrestling, boxing, and horse competitions. Astoundingly, the enormous wooden clad Colosseum could be filled with water to allow sea battles to be performed on it. No shit. And of course, there were the gladiatorial contests that the Romans are famous for: man against man, man against beast, beast against beast. They were cruel and brutal fights to the death. Many gladiators were forced to train and compete, but with great bravery and violence could come great rewards, such as freedom and notoriety. There were also crucifixions and grotesque role plays that prisoners could be forced to participate in. The condemned man was sometimes required to play, in no make believe way, some famous tragic role. He might represent Medea's rival and be garbed in a handsome robe that would suddenly burst into flame and consume him. He might be burned to death on a pyre as Heracles. One victim was dressed as Orpheus. He was sent with his lyre into an arena set as a pleasant grove of trees and brooks. Suddenly, hungry animals emerged from recesses and tore him to pieces. Hearing that, I'm not sure that the Romans really were that civilized, but they were certainly remarkably advanced. Throughout this book, I was regularly impressed by Roman technology, from central heating and water supplies to contraception and art to architecture and infrastructure. The Roman Empire, as with many civilizations, had a large underclass of slaves to facilitate its workings. In the early days of the Roman Republic, slaves were few and were highly valued. As more lands were conquered, slaves became plentiful. It is unlikely the empire could have been constructed or run without slave labour, and certainly not to such a high standard. If the Romans were nothing else, they were impressive. The scale of structure, the length of the luxury, and the systematic work that was performed by slaves who worked like machines. When a territory was conquered, the inhabitants could then be enslaved. Therefore, slaves could be skilled people. They were only slaves because they had been forfeited by defeat, and his enslavement was a merciful commutation of his death. Sometimes he managed his master's property, business, or funds. Sometimes he became a teacher, writer, actor, craftsman, labourer, tradesman, or artist, and paid his master part of his earnings. In this or other ways, he might earn enough to buy his freedom and become a member of the plebs. Roman citizenship was a huge advantage. The slave had no legal rights whatever. Indeed, Roman law hesitated to apply the term persona to him and compromised by calling him an impersonal man. He could not own, inherit, or bequeath. He could not make a legal marriage. His children were all classed as illegitimate, and the children of a slave woman were classed as slaves even if the father was free. Slaves, male or female, might be seduced by their masters without legal redress. The slave could not bring actions in the courts against those who injured him. He could proceed in such a case only through his owner. The latter, under the law of the Republic, could beat him, imprison him, condemn him to fight beasts in the arena, expose him to die of starvation, or kill him with cause or without. It is worth remembering that this is law and not necessarily practice, and over time conditions did gradually improve for slaves, or were at least not so awful, and many slaves were freed by their owners, so many that laws had to be put in place to limit the amount of slaves that could be freed at a time. Once a slave was freed, they became a freed man, which did not give them the same rights as a Roman citizen, but their children would be recognised as Roman citizens. There were other impressive emperors, such as Trajan and Hadrian. Trajan seemed to be an all-round good emperor, as well as being an effective general. Trajan was an able and tireless administrator, a sound financier, a just judge. Hadrian was the wanderer who travelled almost constantly around his empire, building and rebuilding the immense infrastructure and keeping the organisation tight and effective. Then followed Antoninus Pius, who again seemed pretty marvellous. Of Antoninus, there is no history, for he had almost no faults and committed no crimes. The almost saintly emperor, Marcus Aurelius, was followed by his son, who was almost the total opposite, the wannabe gladiator. And it was mostly downhill from there. When Marcus died, Rome had reached the apex of her curve and was already touched with decay. She had accomplished for that confusion of peoples and faiths a unity not of language and culture, but at least of economy and law. She had woven it into a majestic commonwealth, within which the exchange of goods moved in unprecedented plenty and freedom. And for 2 centuries she had guarded the great realm from barbarian inroads and had given it security and peace. Never had there been such wealth, such splendour, or such power. Nevertheless, amidst the prosperity that made Rome brilliant in this 2nd century, all the seeds were germinating of the crisis that would ruin Italy in the 3rd. Durant discusses the impressive architecture of the time, the massive scale of buildings comprising huge columns and domes, and the power of the arch. It was in the great baths and amphitheatres that the new style reached its completion. The baths of Agrippa, Nero, and Titus were the first of a long series that culminated in the baths of Diocletian. They were monumental buildings of concrete faced with stucco or brick, and rising to majestic heights. The interiors were richly decorated with marble and mosaic pavements, vari-coloured columns, coffered ceilings, paintings, and statuary. They were equipped with dressing rooms, hot and cold baths, an intermediate room of warm air, swimming pools, palaestras, libraries, reading rooms, research rooms, lounges, and probably art galleries. Most of the chambers were centrally heated by large clay pipes running under floors and within the walls. These thermae were the most spacious and sumptuous public buildings ever erected, and they have never been equalled in their class. They were part of that socialism of recreation with which the Principate excused its growing monarchy. Never before or since, so far as history tells, have the rich done so much for the poor. Practically all the expenses of operating the city, of financing dramas, spectacles, and games, of building temples, theatres, stadiums, libraries, basilicas, aqueducts, bridges, and baths, and adorning these with arches, porticos, paintings, and statuary, fell upon men of means. And in the first 2 centuries of the empire, these philanthropies were carried out with a competitive patriotism that in some cases bankrupted the families that contributed or the cities that maintained the benefactions. The poor were not overwhelmed with all these gifts. They accused the rich of deriving the means of philanthropy from exploitation, and they demanded less ornate buildings and cheaper corn, less statuary and more games. There had been a big shift in the Roman culture during the 2nd century. The native Roman stock was further depleted and then refilled with outside influences. This changed the nature and values of the Roman psyche. The old Roman image was now an outdated shell. The Senate performed little more than the appearance of power. The emperor had become absolute. Whilst Rome decayed, the provinces prospered, and even the emperors now came from fertile foreign soil. What was Rome's integrity anymore? People had success, but they had lost their meaning, having turned away from the old religions to philosophy in the search for truth. Philosophy now led them to the realization of their human barriers to spiritual development. These people were ripe for a saviour who could give them something new to believe in. Durant gives information about many religions of this time, and he goes into a brief history of Judaism, and he explains the spiritual mood that Jesus was born into, how many people felt that the world was coming to an end, and they were hungry for a saviour to come and lead them to a better world. This was both in the Jewish and the pagan communities. The hope of salvation from Rome and earthly suffering through the coming of a divine Redeemer rings through nearly all the Jewish literature of this age. It is really important to understand the atmosphere that Jesus was born into. People were looking for a saviour. All credit to Jesus, he was an impressive man, although we should appreciate the context that he was preaching in. Jesus, as with many Jews of this time, was preparing for the imminent end of the world. These preachers were in the tone of, get your house in order, you're running out of time, the last judgment is almost upon us, and you need to eradicate all sin from your life before God judges you. These are not the pondered philosophical reflections of the Greeks and Romans as to how do we do living in the best way. This was martyr yourself now, lest you be condemned to eternal hell tomorrow. Forgive me for asking, but is that really how we should be planning the best way to live our lives in the long term? I am a firm believer that decisions made in panic have the wrong outcomes. The recent fuel crisis is a perfect example of that. Durant says of Jesus, it is difficult to see him objectively, not only because the evidence is derived from those who worshipped him, but even more because our own moral heritage and ideals are so closely bound up with him and formed on his example that we feel injured in finding any flaw in his character. His convictions consumed him. Righteous indignation now and then blurred his profound humanity. His faults were the price he paid for that passionate faith which enabled him to move the world. He resembled Caesar only in taking his stand with the lower classes and in the quality of mercy. Otherwise, what a world of outlook, character, and interests separated them. Caesar hoped to reform men by changing institutions and laws. Christ wished to remake institutions and lessen laws by changing men. He is not concerned to attack existing economic or political institutions. The revolution he sought was a far deeper one. If he could cleanse the human heart of selfish desire, cruelty, and lust, utopia would come of itself, and all those institutions that rise out of human greed and violence and the consequent need for law would disappear. And I think it is for this reason that despite the many faults of the Christian church, people do still find it a positive influence in life. It is the religion of Christ, and Christ is the redeeming feature of the religious framework. Christianity spread throughout the Roman world. It appealed to many people. Into the moral vacuum of a dying paganism, into the coldness of Stoicism, and the corruption of Epicureanism, into a world sick of brutality, cruelty, oppression, and sexual chaos, into a pacified empire that seemed no longer to need the masculine virtues or the gods of war. It brought a new morality of brotherhood, kindliness, decency, and peace. Durant now returns to the Roman Empire in the period from AD 193. The emperor is Septimius, and he at least defended the boundaries of the empire. He was followed by Caracalla, who seemed to be just awful. There was now a period of chaotic government in Rome, with the position of emperor regularly being refilled after the assassination of the previous one. It became a position that only the most adventurous or coerced would take on. The empire now failed to produce leaders or man its army from the aristocracy or even the commoners of Italy. Henceforth, provincial legions would choose emperors for a Rome that had lost the fortitude to rule. Whether these military emperors were good statesmen or not, they were unlikely to last long before they met a bloody end. This was not always the case, but in this period it was the norm. Towards the end of the 3rd century, Aurelian attempted to unite Rome in monotheistic worship. It wasn't Christianity that he aimed to institute, but a different sun god based on the Oriental religions. Monarchy and monotheism were advancing side by side, each seeking to make the other its aid. The empire now seemed too large to be centrally organised, and numerous systems were introduced to attempt to keep order, including Diocletian's redividing of the empire and reorganisation of the aristocracy. Diocletian brought in or expanded many stabilising forces in the empire, which laid out the future European systems of serfdom and class rigidity. He brought an end to the period of chaos, and he created an environment that Constantine would utilise. Constantine was the emperor who converted to Christianity. He had a vision which led him to fight under a Christian banner, and he was triumphant. His mother was also a Christian convert. These things led Constantine to appreciate Christianity more than previous emperors had. Constantine extended religious tolerance to the Christian faith, and he later used Christian intolerance to exclude other faiths. Durant questions, was his conversion sincere? Was it an act of religious belief or a consummate stroke of political wisdom? Probably the latter. After his conversion, he seldom conformed to the ceremonial requirements of Christian worship. He was impressed by the comparative order and morality of Christian conduct, the bloodless beauty of Christian ritual, the obedience of Christians to their clergy, their humble acceptance of life's inequalities in the hope of happiness beyond the grave. The Christians, despite bitter repression, had rarely revolted against the state. Their teachers had inculcated submission to the civil powers and had taught the divine right of kings. Constantine aspired to an absolute monarchy. Such a government would profit from religious support. And yet Constantine had to tread carefully in a population that was still predominantly pagan. Although gradually, as his power grew more secure, he favoured Christianity more openly. Because of the rapid spread of Christianity, there were soon many splintered versions of the emerging religion, and this caused an organisational issue for their leaders. The Council of Nicaea was an attempt to solidify Christian beliefs and to stop the many separate branches from progressing. Constantine wanted Christianity to unify the people, not to breed more division. Although, just for the record, the Christian Trinity is polytheistic. Come on, mental gymnastics aside, it is. The Council of Nicaea also marked the replacement of paganism with Christianity as the religious expression and support of the Roman Empire, and committed Constantine to a more definite alliance with Christianity than ever before. A new civilization based on a new religion would now rise over the ruins of an exhausted culture and a dying creed. The Middle Ages had begun. Durant discusses why Rome fell and concludes that there were many factors at play, and that ultimately a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself within. He discusses the decline and decay of Rome from its people and morals to its production of goods and commerce. The virile character that had been formed by arduous simplicities and a supporting faith relaxed in the sunshine of wealth and the freedom of unbelief. Also, a serious decline of population appears in the West after Hadrian. This was mainly caused by family limitation, as well as by pestilence and war. Durant concludes that Rome had no rival for the art of government. The Roman state committed 1,000 political crimes. It built its edifice upon a selfish oligarchy and an obscurantist priesthood. It achieved a democracy of free men and then destroyed it with corruption and violence. It exploited its conquests to support a parasitic Italy, which, when it could no longer exploit, collapsed. Rome built a culture Greek in origin, Roman in application and result. She enriched the world with a commerce moving over secure seas and a network of enduring roads that became the arteries of a lusty life. There is a lot of information given in this book, and Durant has sectioned it pretty well. He goes over a set period of time and separates out sections for attention. For me, by far the most exciting parts were the run-throughs of who was in power, how they rose, how they shone, and how they were crushed. There were also sections on the great developments, such as philosophy, medicine, art, or architecture, and also on the everyday life for most Romans. This gave great depth to each period. However, it could mean that many chapters were devoted to one period of time. I certainly felt that 30 BC to AD 96 was never going to end. Not that it wasn't interesting, but just because we went over that bloody time period so many times. There was a lot in this book about the arts, entertainment, religion, and culture of the time, and how this developed or deteriorated through the centuries, and many notable writers, philosophers, and interesting people were discussed. Durant manages to convey vast amounts of information in this well-written, concise, and flowing story, filled with interconnecting characters and a series of events more fantastic than anyone could make up. The Romans carved out new extremes in mankind's potential, particularly in their moral exploits. they could be admirable examples of the excellence of mankind, active and brave, intelligent and wise, ambitious and with foresight. They could also be cruel and merciless, depraved and murderous. What I'm most surprised about is that they did all this 2,000 years ago. In many ways, they were far more advanced than we are, certainly in terms of their understanding of life and their ambition. One of the reasons I wanted to read this book was to find out more about Christ and the early establishment of Christianity. I learnt a lot from this book, and unfortunately, most of it was disappointing. If I'm honest, I was much more impressed by the Romans than I was by the Jews and Christians, who came across as far too dogmatic and uncompromising for me. I also got pissed off because of the extreme misogyny of the founders of Christianity. In fairness to Jesus, he doesn't seem to hate women as much, but he still recommends avoiding them like the plague. This book also showed the full philosophical journey, which unsurprisingly ends in pessimism and the realization that most people in the world are weak minded and cowardly. In conclusion, I have loved reading this book. It has been even more interesting than I thought it would be. The Romans were fucking awesome, and we should all know more about them. I finished this book feeling disappointment with how far we haven't come since the Romans. I would go so far as to say we are backwards today. Psychologically and spiritually, most people are shamefully undeveloped. And for someone who's obsessed with the meaning of life, it's really fucking depressing. Don't get me wrong, the Romans got shitloads of stuff wrong. But was the unbending, non developing religious millennia that followed really better? Okay, here it is again. It's a really big book. I want to praise the library service as well, because when I looked into buying this book, it was pretty pricey. And now I've been able to read it for free thanks to the library service. The next book I will be reviewing is another meaty one. It's The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Please join me for that. And if you've managed to get to the end of this review, thank you.